Frank paused in the doorway, his weathered hands still gripping the keys, and turned to look at the source of these sounds. There he was again, the tawny-colored mutt with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. The locals had taken to calling him Scout, though no one quite knew who had started it. What everyone did know was that Scout had become as much a fixture of the neighborhood as the old oak tree in the town square or Mrs. Peterson's prize-winning petunias. Every morning, without fail, Scout would appear at the store's entrance, carrying a stick in his mouth. Sometimes it was a slender twig, barely the length of a pencil. Other times, it was a proper branch that looked comically large in his jaws. Today's offering was a medium-sized piece of maple, still bearing a few dried leaves that rustled softly in the morning breeze. "There he goes again," Sarah Martinez called out from behind her register, where she was counting the previous day's receipts. The young cashier had worked at Thompson's Market for 3 summers now, and she developed a particular fondness for their unusual visitor. "You know, Mr. Thompson, I saw him doing the same thing at Joe's Hardware yesterday. It's like he's trying to barter or something." Frank shook his head, trying to maintain his usual businesslike demeanor. But there was something about the dog's earnest expression that made it difficult. "It's just a stray doing stray things, Sarah. We got work to do." He moved toward his office, pretending not to notice how Scout's tail dropped slightly at being ignored. Throughout the morning, customers came and went, each reacting differently to the peculiar sight of Scout and his stick. Mrs. Anderson, a retired schoolteacher, would always coo and fuss over him, though she never quite worked up the courage to touch him. The Jenkins twins, on their way to high school, would snap pictures with their phones, probably for their social media accounts. Even gruff old Mr. Peterson, who complained about everything from the price of milk to the weather, would give Scout a grudging nod of acknowledgement. As Frank worked through his morning inventory, he found his eyes constantly drawn to the front windows. Scout remained at his post, occasionally shifting position to stay in the shade, but never abandoning his stick. The dog's persistence was beginning to crack something in Frank's carefully maintained professional facade. "Did you know," Clara Watson said as she arranged her organic produce display, "that I've seen him picking up these sticks from the park 3 blocks over? He's very particular about them, too. Sometimes he'll spend ages choosing just the right one." Clara had been working at Thompson's Market for over a decade, and she had a way of noticing things others missed. Frank tried to focus on his clipboard, but Clara's words painted a picture in his mind. Scout carefully examining fallen branches in the pre-dawn light, testing their weight and balance, selecting the perfect offering for another day of hope. The image stayed with him as he worked through the morning rush, as he updated the weekly specials, as he helped Mrs. Davidson find the gluten-free pasta she swore had moved shelves it hadn't. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows, creating golden pools on the linoleum floor, when Frank finally allowed himself to really look at Scout again. The dog had maintained his vigil for hours, taking brief breaks only to lap water from a puddle near the curb or to scratch behind his ears. His stick lay before him like an offering, and his eyes, those impossibly knowing eyes, met Frank's with an expression that seemed to say, "I can wait. I have all the time in the world." Something shifted in Frank's chest, a subtle realignment of thoughts and feelings he'd been trying to ignore. He found himself wondering about Scout's story, where he came from, what drove him to this curious behavior, and most importantly, his stubborn ritual of bringing sticks day after day. As the day drew to a close and the sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Frank stood at his office window, watching Scout. The dog's shadow had grown long on the pavement, but his patience seemed endless. A memory stirred in Frank's mind of another dog, years ago, when his children were small and the world seemed simpler. Before the divorce, before the kids grew up and moved away, before the market became his entire world. "Mr. Thompson?" Sarah's voice broke through his reverie. "I'm heading out for the day. Do you think maybe we could leave something for Scout? Just a little food? He's been here all day." Frank looked at his young employee's hopeful face, then back at Scout, who was now gently nudging his stick with his nose, as if making sure it was still perfectly positioned. The last rays of sunlight caught Scout's fur, giving him an almost golden glow, and in that moment, Frank Thompson, practical, business-minded Frank Thompson, felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. The simple, pure desire to show kindness without reason or reward. "You know what, Sarah?" he said, reaching for his keys. "I think I might have some leftover roast beef in my lunch bag. Why don't you take it out to him before you leave?" Sarah's face lit up with a smile that made Frank wonder when he'd become quite so stern, quite so removed from the simple pleasures of making others happy. As she hurried to get the food, Frank watched Scout through the window, still at his post, still faithful to his mysterious mission, unaware that his persistent vigil was about to be rewarded. And as the day's last customer left the store, their shopping bags rustling in the evening breeze, Frank Thompson found himself wondering if perhaps there was more to learn from a stray dog with a stick than he'd initially thought possible. The roast beef sat in Frank's hand for a moment longer than necessary, its wrapping crinkling softly against his calloused palm. Through the storefront windows, the street lamps were beginning to flicker to life, casting pools of yellow light that made Scout's fur look almost golden. The dog hadn't moved from his spot, his stick still laid out before him like an offering to some ancient deity of commerce. Sarah had already left for the day, her suggestion about feeding Scout hanging in the air like the last notes of a familiar song. Frank found himself moving toward the door, his sensible leather shoes clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. Each step felt deliberate, as if he were crossing some invisible boundary he'd drawn years ago between himself and the world beyond his store's walls. The evening air carried the crisp scent of approaching autumn, mingled with the lingering warmth of an Indian summer day. As Frank pushed open the heavy glass door, the familiar bell chimed above his head, a sound he'd heard thousands of times before, but somehow tonight it seemed different, more meaningful. Scout's ears perked up at the sound, but he remained stationed by his stick, his tail making small, hopeful sweeps against the concrete. "Well," Frank said, his voice rougher than he'd intended, "I suppose you've earned this." He unwrapped the roast beef, the paper making a sound that finally broke Scout's steadfast position. The dog's nose twitched, and his eyes, those deep brown eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations within them, locked onto Frank's face with an intensity that made him catch his breath. Frank lowered himself to one knee, ignoring the protest of his joints and the voice in his head that reminded him of his dry-clean-only slacks. He held out the meat, and Scout took a tentative step forward, then another. The stick remained where it was, as if anchoring the dog to his post. When Scout finally reached Frank, his movements were gentle, almost reverent, as he took the offered food from Frank's hand. As Scout ate, Frank found himself talking, something he hadn't done freely in years, not since Maria left, taking their children and most of his ability to connect with others along with her. "You're a peculiar one, aren't you?" he said softly, watching as Scout delicately consumed every morsel. "All these sticks day after day. What are you trying to tell us?" The street had grown quiet, the usual evening traffic reduced to occasional passing cars whose headlights swept across the scene like searching fingers. In the distance, someone's wind chimes tinkled and a dog barked, but Scout paid no attention to these distractions. He finished his meal and looked up at Frank with an expression that seemed to contain equal parts gratitude and expectation. To Frank's surprise, Scout didn't immediately grab his stick and leave. Instead, he sat down, his pose almost regal, and continued to gaze at Frank with those impossibly expressive eyes. The moment stretched between them, filled with the kind of comfortable silence Frank hadn't experienced in years. "Mr. Thompson?" The voice startled both man and dog. It was Clara Watson, emerging from the back of the store where she'd been finishing the day's produce inventory. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but—" She paused, taking in the unusual sight of her usually stern employer kneeling on the sidewalk with a stray dog. "I just wanted to say that Scout's been coming here for exactly 3 months now. I've been keeping track." Frank stood up slowly, brushing off his knees. 3 months. The information settled in his mind like a key fitting into a lock. 3 months ago, his son Michael had called, attempting another reconciliation that Frank had rebuffed with his usual stubborn pride. 3 months of Scout's patient vigil, of sticks presented like peace offerings, of quiet persistence in the face of indifference. Clara nodded, clutching her clipboard to her chest. Every single day, rain or shine, sometimes twice a day, and always with a stick. She hesitated, then added, "You know, my grandmother used to say that sometimes angels come in strange disguises." Frank might have scoffed at such sentiment any other time, but standing there in the growing darkness, with Scout's warm presence beside him and the memory of his son's voice echoing in his mind, he found himself unable to dismiss the idea entirely. The next morning, Frank arrived at the store earlier than usual. The sky was still the deep purple of approaching dawn, and the air held that peculiar stillness that belongs exclusively to the hours before the world properly wakes. He wasn't surprised to find Scout already waiting, a new stick laid carefully beside him. This time, Frank didn't walk past. Instead, he set down the bag he'd brought specifically for this moment. Filled with premium dog food he'd purchased the previous evening from the pet store 3 blocks over. As Scout ate, Frank sat on the store's front step, watching the sunrise paint the world in watercolor hues of pink and gold. "You know," he said conversationally to Scout, "I've been thinking about sticks." Scout's ears twitched in his direction, though he continued eating. "They're interesting things, really. They could be used to build, to play, to connect. But they can also be broken, can't they? Snapped clean in two by stubbornness or pride." Scout finished his breakfast and sat up, his attention fully focused on Frank. The morning light caught in his fur, highlighting strands of gold and amber that Frank had never noticed before. The stick lay between them, no longer just a piece of wood, but something more symbolic. A bridge, perhaps, or an olive branch. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. For a moment, he just held it, feeling its weight in his hand. Then, with Scout watching intently, he began to dial a number he knew by heart, but hadn't called in 3 months. As the phone rang, Scout picked up his stick and gently aced it across Frank's shoes, then sat back, tail wagging slowly. The simple gesture brought an unexpected lump to Frank's throat. "Dad!" Michael's voice was thick with sleep and surprise. It's really early." "I know," Frank said, his free hand absently reaching down to touch the stick that Scout had offered. "I know it is, but I've been thinking, maybe we could have breakfast together? There's someone I'd like you to meet." The silence that followed was brief, but weighted with possibility. Then Michael's voice came back, warmer now. "Yeah, Dad. I'd like that." Scout's tail thumped against the concrete in a steady rhythm, and Frank found himself smiling. Really smiling. For the first time in what felt like years. The sun continued its ascent into the morning sky, casting long shadows behind them, but illuminating the path ahead with golden promise. The day was just beginning, and already Frank could feel something shifting, transforming, like winter giving way to spring. Scout remained beside him, a steady presence in a world that suddenly seemed full of possibilities. The stick between them was just a stick, but also so much more. A key, a bridge, a beginning. And as the first customers of the day began to appear on the horizon, Frank Thompson realized that sometimes the greatest gifts come not in grand gestures or carefully wrapped packages, but in the simple, persistent offering of a stray dog with a stick and a heart full of patience. The rest of that day passed in a blur of routine tasks and quiet contemplation. Frank found himself watching the clock more often than usual, anticipating his breakfast with Michael the next morning. Scout had remained near the store throughout the day, but there was something different about his behavior. A subtle urgency that hadn't been there before, as if the breakthrough with Frank had shifted something in the dog's mysterious mission. As evening approached, the autumn sky darkened earlier than usual, heavy clouds rolling in from the west like a velvet curtain being drawn across the heavens. The street lamps flickered to life, their glow creating halos in the light mist that had begun to fall. Frank was doing his final inventory check, his mind still lingering on the morning's phone call, when he heard it, a different kind of scratching at the store's front door than Scout's usual gentle patting. The sound carried a desperate edge that made Frank look up from his clipboard. Through the glass, he could see Scout pacing back and forth, but instead of his usual stick, he carried what looked like a small branch, nearly as long as he was. The dog's movements were agitated, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an almost frantic energy that made Frank's heart skip a beat. "I'm closing up, boy," Frank called through the glass, but Scout's response was a sharp bark, the first time Frank had ever heard him make more than a quiet whine. The sound echoed off the empty streets, carrying with it an unmistakable note of urgency. Clara, who was finishing up her closing duties, appeared beside Frank. "Something's wrong," she said softly, her eyes fixed on Scout's unusual behavior. "I've never seen him like this." Frank hesitated only a moment before reaching for his coat and flashlight. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him isolated and safe for so many years, tried to argue that following a stray dog into the night was foolish. But something stronger, something awakened by the morning's reconnection with his son, pushed him forward. "I'll handle the final lockup, Mr. Thompson," Clara offered, understanding in her eyes. "You go see what he needs." The moment Frank pushed open the door, Scout dropped the branch at his feet and darted a few steps away, looking back with an intensity that clearly said, "Follow me." The mist had thickened into a light drizzle, and the autumn air had taken on a biting chill that hadn't been there during the day. "All right, Scout," Frank said, zipping up his coat. "Show me what's so important." Scout led him away from the well-lit main street, past the familiar landmarks of Frank's daily world. They moved through the gathering darkness, past Joe's Hardware, closed now, its windows dark, past the old Peterson place with its overgrown garden, and into parts of the neighborhood Frank hadn't visited in years. The dog moved with purpose, occasionally looking back to ensure Frank was still following, his paws silent on the wet pavement. The sound of traffic grew distant, replaced by the whisper of wind through trees and the occasional rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Frank's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, catching raindrops in its path like falling stars. They turned down Aberdeen Street, a once prosperous area that had fallen into disrepair after the factory closure 10 years ago. The streetlights here were fewer and farther between, some broken, others flickering weakly against the night. Scout led him past abandoned storefronts with boarded windows, their faded signs telling stories of better days. Frank's shoes, not meant for this kind of expedition, were soaked through from puddles and wet grass. His rational mind had long since given up arguing, replaced by a growing sense that he was part of something important, something larger than himself. The transformation that had begun with a simple act of kindness that morning was continuing, leading him literally into unknown territory. Scout stopped suddenly at the entrance to what had once been Riverside Storage, a sprawling complex of storage units and warehouses that had been abandoned when the river flooded 5 years ago. The chain-link fence that surrounded the property had a gap just large enough for a medium-sized dog to slip through, or, Frank realized with a grunt, a determined man to squeeze past. The dog's urgency had reached a peak. He darted through the fence opening and waited, his eyes reflecting the beam of Frank's flashlight like twin moons. The rain had picked up, drumming a steady rhythm on the metal roofs of the storage units. The sound echoed through the empty complex, creating an eerie symphony that made the hair on the back of Frank's neck stand up. "I hope you know what you're doing, boy," Frank muttered, but he followed, his clothes catching slightly on the rough edges of the fence. The beam of his flashlight revealed a maze of storage units, their doors in various states of decay, some hanging open like hungry mouths in the darkness. Scout led him deeper into the complex, past rows of units, until they reached a smaller warehouse set apart from the others. Its windows were mostly intact, though grimy with years of neglect, and its door hung slightly ajar. The dog slipped inside without hesitation, but Frank paused at the threshold. The beam of his flashlight caught dust motes dancing in the air, and the musty smell of abandonment filled his nostrils. But there was something else, a sound so faint he might have missed it if he hadn't been holding his breath. A whimper, high-pitched and weak, followed by the unmistakable sound of Scout's tail thumping against the concrete floor. Frank Thompson stood in that doorway, rain dripping from his coat, flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand, and felt the weight of a decision. He could turn back now, return to his orderly life, his predictable routine, pretend this night had never happened. Or he could step forward into the unknown, trust in the wisdom of a stray dog who had already changed his life once today. From the darkness beyond his flashlight beam, Scout whined softly, not the desperate sound from earlier, but an encouraging noise, almost gentle. as if he knew exactly what was going through Frank's mind and was saying, "Trust me one more time." The sound of another whimper from within the darkness made the decision for him. Frank Thompson, who had spent years building wall LS around his heart, took a deep breath and stepped through the doorway. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty warehouse, but they were steady, determined. Whatever Scout had brought him here to find, he was ready to face it. And as he moved deeper into the warehouse, his flashlight beam cutting through layers of darkness, Frank realized that sometimes the greatest journeys don't take us across continents or over mountains, but simply through the doorways we've been too afraid to enter, guided by the most unexpected of angels. The beam of Frank's flashlight trembled slightly as he moved deeper into the warehouse, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like phantom performers in some ethereal ballet. The air grew thicker here, heavy with the weight of abandonment and secrets. Scout's nails clicked against the concrete floor, creating a steady rhythm that somehow made the darkness feel less oppressive. As they moved further in, Frank's senses heightened to every detail. The musty smell of old cardboard boxes piled in corners, the whisper of wind through unseen gaps in the walls, the occasional drip of water from the leaking roof that created small pools on the uneven floor. His breath came out in visible puffs in the cold air, adding to the dreamlike quality of the moment. Scout led him past rows of abandoned shelving units, their metal frames rusted and bent like the rib cages of ancient beasts. The dog's pace quickened, and the whimpering sounds grew clearer, more distinct. They seemed to be coming from behind a collection of old wooden pallets stacked against the far wall. Frank's flashlight beam caught movement, a small flutter of shadow that made his heart skip a beat. Scout darted forward, disappearing behind the pallets, and the whimpering transformed into a chorus of tiny, desperate sounds that echoed off the warehouse walls. "Good Lord," Frank whispered, his voice catching in his throat as his flashlight finally illuminated the scene before him. There, in a nest made of tattered cardboard and what appeared to be Scout's collected sticks, lay 5 tiny puppies. Their eyes were barely open, their bodies so small they could each fit in the palm of Frank's hand. They squirmed and wiggled, their little paws reaching blindly toward Scout, who had positioned himself protectively beside them. The reality of Scout's daily missions with the sticks hit Frank with the force of a physical blow. Every stick, every patient wait outside the store, it hadn't been about trade or food at all. Scout had been gathering materials to build and maintain this nest, trying to create some semblance of warmth and shelter for these helpless creatures. As Frank knelt beside the makeshift den, his knees protesting against the cold concrete, he noticed how Scout had carefully woven the sticks together, creating a kind of barrier against the draft that whistled through the warehouse. Some of the sticks still had leaves attached, providing additional insulation. It was ingenious in its desperation, heartbreaking in its inadequacy. "This is what you've been trying to tell us," Frank said softly, reaching out to touch Scout's head. The dog leaned into his hand, and Frank felt a tremor run through the animal's body. Scout was exhausted, he realized, exhausted from running between his puppies and the store, from trying to care for them alone, from carrying the weight of their survival on his shoulders. One of the puppies, bolder than its siblings, crawled toward Frank's flashlight beam, its tiny nose twitching at the new scent. In the artificial light, Frank could see they were a mix of colors, some brown like Scout, others with patches of black and white. Their little bellies were rounded, suggesting that Scout had somehow managed to keep them fed, but they were clearly cold, their small bodies shivering despite the nest protection. Frank shrugged off his coat without hesitation, his body immediately protesting against the warehouse's chill. With gentle movements that surprised even himself, he draped it over the puppy nest, creating a tint of warmth. The puppies immediately huddled together beneath it, their whimpers softening to contented sighs. Scout watched this with those intelligent eyes, and Frank could have sworn he saw relief in them. The dog moved closer to Frank, pressing against his leg in a gesture of trust that made Frank's throat tight with emotion. Here was a creature who had spent months trying to communicate his need, who had shown more patience and determination than most humans Frank had known. Pulling out his phone, Frank was grateful to see he still had signal, though it was weak. His fingers, stiff with cold, moved across the screen as he pulled up his contacts. He scrolled past the usual business numbers until he found what he was looking for. The card Clara had given him months ago for the local animal shelter. The one he kept meaning to throw away, but somehow never had. As he waited for the call to connect, Frank found himself talking softly to Scout and the puppies, his voice carrying a gentleness he'd forgotten he possessed. "Don't worry," he murmured, watching as one of the puppies poked its tiny head out from under his coat. "We're gonna fix this. All of it." The phone rang once, twice, and on the third ring, a tired voice answered. Frank quickly explained the situation, his words tumbling out with an urgency that reflected the night's events. The shelter worker, to her credit, didn't question why a man was calling about puppies in an abandoned warehouse at this hour. She simply took down the address and promised to send someone immediately. While they waited, Frank settled himself more comfortably on the floor, ignoring the cold that seeped through his clothes. Scout laid his head on Frank's knee, and together they watched over the puppies, who had begun to explore the edges of their coat tent with increasing curiosity. The smallest one, a little brown pup with a white splash on its chest, managed to escape the makeshift shelter and wobbled determinedly toward Frank. Without thinking, he scooped it up, cradling it against his chest. The puppy's heart beat like a tiny drum against his palm, its warmth seeping through his shirt and into his skin. "You know," Frank said to Scout, who was watching the interaction with apparent approval, "I had a dog when I was a boy. Named him Rusty. He used to wait for me after school, right at the corner of our street." The memory, long buried under years of adult concerns and responsibilities, surfaced with surprising clarity. "I'd forgotten what that felt like, having someone so happy to see you, so unconditionally there." Scout's tail thumped against the floor, and Frank continued, his voice soft in the darkness. "When Maria left, taking the kids, I convinced myself it was better to keep everyone at arm's length. Safer, you know? But you don't do that, do you? You just keep showing up, keep trying, keep loving." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. The puppy in his hands yawned, showing a pink tongue no bigger than a rose petal, and snuggled deeper into his grip. Its siblings, perhaps missing their brave explorer, began squeaking in protest until Scout gently nudged them back under the coat. In the distance, Frank heard the sound of vehicles approaching, tires crunching on gravel. Help was coming. Soon this warehouse would be filled with light and movement and human voices. The puppies would be whisked away to warmth and safety, their future suddenly bright with possibilities. But for now, in these last quiet moments, Frank Thompson sat in the darkness of an abandoned warehouse, holding a tiny life in his hands, while beside him sat a dog who had taught him more about persistence, love, and courage in a few months than he'd learned in all his years of careful isolation. And as the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the night, Frank made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours ago. These puppies wouldn't be going to the shelter alone. Scout had built them a nest of sticks and hope. Now it was Frank's turn to build them something more permanent, a home.